our Bram Fischer lecture activities for this year. It's a great thrill to invite you all here to what I'm sure is going to be a fantastic day. We have a little bonus this year. We have 2 talks for the price of 1. We always like to give good value for money in Oxford. And I'm delighted to say that our first talk is going to be provided by Bram Fischer's biographer. No one better, in a sense, to give the talk today than Professor Stephen Clingman, who's Professor of English and Director of Interdisciplinary Studies. And I think for many of us here who didn't know Bram personally, like myself, but who are heavily involved in the lecture, we've come to know Bram to a certain extent through your book. So it's great to have you here speaking. We also have a discussant, and I'm equally pleased to be able to introduce Yvonne Milan. Yvonne is very seminal to this lecture because if it wasn't for her, we wouldn't be here. She was the one who a few years ago, when this lecture had lapsed, came to me and said, I think we need to get this lecture started in Oxford. So we wouldn't be sitting in this room if it wasn't for Yvonne and her energies. And so I'm delighted that we've been able to welcome her back to Oxford today to be a discussant on the paper. So Stephen will speak first, Yvonne will come as discussant, we'll open up to a Q&A, and I'll let it run for as long as I possibly can before we start having to get the arrangements ready for the next lecture at 5 o'clock. Stephen, thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Nick, and thank you all for coming. It's a great honor to be here, especially to be here along with Dennis Goldberg, who will be speaking later today. And I, for one, am looking forward to that very much, Dennis. I'd like to say thanks to Nicholas Cheeseman, to Yvonne Milan for being a discussant today, to my new publishers, Jacana, who've put out a new edition of the book, and more distantly to Bram Fischer's daughters, Ruth and Ilse, who supported me all the way, and then various other people who've been involved in this project, including William Baynard, who helped arrange the deposition of the Fischer papers, or at least my copy of the Fischer papers here at Oxford. And most particularly today, I'm grateful to Lord Joel Joffe, who has been a supporter of, who was a supporter of my work on Bram Fischer right from the very start. In fact, he suggested it, along with Arthur Chaskelson. I'm extremely grateful to him, and I'd like to remember Arthur as well today, who was truly a very important figure in my life. Just this last week, I saw a letter that Arthur wrote to Tom Karras, the historian, political historian and legal historian, which I saw just last week. It was written in 1982, and it reminded me of the conditions of semi-clandestinity and secrecy in which I had to begin the work. It was a letter that Arthur could not mail from South Africa to Tom in the USA. And he gave it to me in a sealed envelope, and I sent it to Tom, and last week was the first time I had seen that letter, reminding me of how it began. And how it began was actually with Joel and Arthur coming to see me and my wife in Summertown, where we were staying in about 1982 or thereabouts. And they arrived with 2 blue and white Tesco bags. That's how I remember it. And inside those Tesco bags were letters from Bram Fischer to his future wife, Molly, and from Molly to him. And they were suggesting at that point that a biography needed to be written and that perhaps I'd be interested in doing it. And when I saw the letters, I thought, yes, I am interested in doing it, because those letters gave me the sense that here was a whole person that I could try to write about. I'm not actually a political historian, I'm not a legal historian, I come from a different discipline, so to speak. But those letters gave me an enormous amount of insight into Bram Fischer and into Molly and into the world in which they lived. And that began the whole project, which crossed 3 different continents. I interviewed some 80 people thereabouts, often on a very rickety tape recorder in the pre-digital age. I studied in the archives, I read court records. Various people were very generous to me and gave me letters and documents of all kinds. And so I'm not sure that anybody can ever understand the whole person, whoever that person happens to be, but the book began to take shape for me. And for those of you who've read it, or those of you who may read it, you'll see that it begins in the desert and it ends on the mountaintop. And that's an almost mythic dimension to me. And the mountaintop is the place from which one has a view of the promised land. It's the promised land one might never reach, but nonetheless, it's a vision of the promised land. And I think that that was very important to Bram Fischer. So I'd like to set the frame for this by thinking about two different Aprils. The one was in April 1964, the 20th of April to be exact, close to Bram Fischer's 56th birthday, when he rose to open the defense at the Rivonia trial. He did so in his characteristic quiet way, very aware of the stakes. The stakes, as no one knows better than Dennis Goldberg, was the possibility of death sentences. Earlier, Bram Fischer had seen evidence handed into court in his own handwriting, which went unidentified in court. He looked at the documents, passed them to his colleagues, the other counsel, who stared at these things amazed that Bram Fischer would have, the leader for the defense case would see these documents in his own handwriting. But for him, it was perhaps the greatest place of safety he could find. This was in the international spotlight. The government was probably not going to arrest the leader of the defense in the Rivonia trial right there in open court. And the outcome, as everybody knows, was that the accused, or those who had the possibility of death sentences, were sentenced to life imprisonment. It was a triumph. Normally, life sentences would not be something you would be happy about, but in this case, it was something to celebrate. And that brings us to the 2nd April, exactly 30 years later, which was in 1994, of course. And we tend not to remember everybody else who was involved, either in the Rivonia trial or everybody who made that transition possible. We focus on Nelson Mandela, whose passing so recently is on everybody's minds. And yet Mandela was, as I think we would all agree, very special. And it was in April 1994 that Nelson Mandela returned to become first president of a free and democratic South Africa. If one wants to think in mythic terms, he had come back from the island, the place of exclusion, back to the world with a different kind of vision. He had made his journey to the underworld. He'd returned to the place where he could see everybody and everybody could see him. And he came back with a vision of transformation. But again, he did not do so alone, and that is part of my point today, that he did so along with other people. By that 2nd April, April 1994, Bram Fischer had been gone for nearly 20 years, and yet I would say that his spirit was there as well, part of that moment. And we can say in one sense that his link with 1994 was direct, because if there hadn't been life sentences, there would have been no return. But there are deeper patterns as well. So what did Bram Fischer have to do with those two moments, those 2 Aprils? How did he become the person who played such a significant role? What was his contribution? And equally important, what was his legacy? So what I'm going to do now is review some of his stories. Some of you will know the story well, others perhaps not so well. And what I want to do is, in reviewing some aspects of his life, to draw out certain themes which I think are important with a view to my title, The Transition to Democracy. I want to stress that I'm talking today as a biographer, not as professional historian or a political scientist. And so it is that person in the moment that I'm trying to think about. So Bram Fischer was born on April the 23rd, 1908. In fact, we share a birthday, something that encouraged me when I began. His father, Percy, was Judge President of the Orange Free State. His grandfather, Abraham Fischer, was Prime Minister of the Orange River Colony and had been a leading figure in the Orange Free State in the lead up to the Boer War. Both father and grandfather were lawyers, like Bram. Percy had been to Cambridge. The standard saying about Braun was that he would be either Prime Minister or Chief Justice of South Africa, but as we all know, it turned out differently. What I would pick out here is a number of things. First of all, is the question of nationalism, specifically Africana nationalism. This was an aspect of Bram Fischer's identity, and I mean being an Afrikaner, that never left him. Yet he was able to work through and come out of nationalism, and that's a different point. There's an intriguing relationship between identity and identification. Bram's identity coming out of the Afrikaner fold never left him, but he certainly moved out of nationalism. One thing he did not move out of was anti-imperialism, because what was the Anglo-Boer War about if not anti-imperialism, at least as far as the Afrikaners saw it. And in fact, in the aftermath of the war, in fact in the aftermath of Union in 1914, when South Africa went into the First World War on the side of Britain, there was a rebellion against their entry, and Bram Fischer's father was kind of indirectly involved. He formed an ambulance to join the rebels, and although he was not put on trial for that, he lost his practice suffered, and the family had to go live on a farm. But that whole idea of being anti-imperialist was something that Bram Fischer could relate to quite closely, as he could relate to something equally important, that leadership was not the opposite of rebellion, but that leadership and rebellion could be the same thing. They could be conjoined. So that later on, when he was arrested for the first time and put on trial, his mother said to him, not to worry, the Fischers are quite used to this. And something else never left him, because when he and his family moved to that small farm, Braun played on the farm. He played with black friends, he played with white friends, but they played Boer War games in which the British lost, by and large. And he wanted to be a farmer. He had thoughts of being a farmer when he left school. There was that attachment to the land, and I think also a determination never to leave South Africa when he was faced with that choice. And then one last thing, even from these early days, is the question of family itself. Bram Fischer came from a very closely knit family. They didn't all agree politically, quite the contrary, but that closeness never left them. And I think what Bram Fischer did was translate that notion of family into a sense of the broader South African family, and then later on into a very closely knit version of family that he had with his political comrades. He had some distance to travel. In 1924, when the first nationalist Labour PAC government was elected in 1924, there was Bram Fischer and his cousin Connie Anderson cheering like anything in the square in Bloemfontein at the results. But at the same time, he was being mentored by Leo Marquardt, who himself had been to Oxford, who founded NUSAS, and took him to joint council meetings. These were joint councils of Africans and Europeans, where for the first time, and Bram, this was a meaningful experience to him, he shook hands with a black man and for the first time recoiled. And as a child, he had played with black children. And this was something I think quite special about Bram Fischer, because he didn't try to justify his feelings, he didn't find fault in the world outside him. He began a process of introspection. What had changed? What had made him become a different kind of person? And at that point, as he said, because he mentioned this in his speech from the dock some 35 years later, he began a process of introspection in which he understood that racial discrimination was a completely irrational phenomenon. And there was Bram Fischer, a man of tremendous integrity, taking account, taking responsibility. And later on, when he spoke about it in his speech from the dock, he said that at that point, his understanding that color prejudice was a wholly irrational phenomenon was his turning point in a dedication to a belief, as he put it, in an idea 2,000 years old of the eventual brotherhood of all men. So this explained his attraction to the Communist Party, but the longer reference here, the 2,000 years, is of course to the Christian era. And Bram Fischer, who was himself an atheist, I think saw himself as part of a broad heritage, a broad legacy. For him, communism was not only the present, but the future, but nonetheless, it could ally itself with other traditions. And I think that's true of the South African struggle as well, that it has been and was a movement that came out of many traditions. Albert Luthuli, himself a devoted Christian, could work with people of other ideologies, other beliefs, and so on. An important staging post for Braun was when he came right here to Rhodes. And in fact, I was thinking, just as I was coming into Oxford yesterday, and I passed the front gate of New College, that I could have given a talk called Bram Fischer and Oxford. And it would have been quite an interesting talk, I think, but that's not what I've done. But Bram's first introduction to New College, he wrote back to Molly and he said, when I saw that big wooden gate, and you can see it now still, he said, I felt exactly as if I was going to prison. And he said in Afrikaans, he said, my hartjie word koud, which was a saying that the Fishers had, which basically means my heart, but it's a diminutive. My little heart became cold. It was becoming cold. And that was a feeling of sort of misery and loneliness. When you were alone, that's what you felt. And that's what he felt here at first. But not for long. He was ensconced in the Rhodes House setting. And soon he began to travel. He traveled on the continent. He went to student congresses in various places in Europe. And he saw there the rise of Nazism, the rise of fascism. And he took note as someone coming out of Africana nationalism. And he also, in the summer of 1932, went to the Soviet Union. And it's so fascinating. It was really fascinating for me to read his letters back from the Soviet Union at that time. He wrote in English to his mother and to his siblings, but to his father he wrote in Afrikaans. And he wrote as a social scientist in a way. He was trying to find out what the future would look like. And, they were taken around by official guides. Surely they were taken to show farms and to show factories and so on. But for Bram Fischer, that wasn't the point. And he saw that it's so interesting to see how he translated what he was seeing into terms that he could understand and that people in South Africa would understand. And for him, what was happening in the Soviet Union had to do with a number of different things. It had to do with nationalism, had to do with race, and it had to do with modernization. And he translated the issue of Russia as being one of bringing a peasant society into the 21st century. And he saw South African blacks as peasants who needed to be modernized. And he thought that the Soviet Union had also solved the problem of nationality, because there were many nationalities in the USSR. Stalin had been commissar for nationalities. Now, he may have been, misled in some of these perceptions, but nonetheless, that's how he saw it. And one point I'd really like to make here is that it's easy to judge in hindsight, to say somebody was misled or look at what he didn't see. But Bram Fischer did see certain things. He saw a different kind of future, and what he saw was that the future was going to be a battle between two great forces. And the forces were, on the one hand, socialism, and on the other hand, fascism. And that's what Europe was gearing up for, and he began to understand which side he was on. And he was also prepared to make choices in the present. As I say, hindsight is easy. It's never easy to make choices in the present. And when he made those choices, he gave his all, as we know from what happened later. So that question, his brothers said to me that there was something about Braun that was credulous. He gave his beliefs a little too easily. But I think credulity has its virtues as well. Credulity as a matter of belief, when rationally you might think certain things are impossible, will take you where you might otherwise not have gone. Rationally in the 1980s, it didn't look as if apartheid would fall. At least not to me it didn't. I don't think to many other people. But there was nonetheless a belief that it could fall. People worked very hard for it. And among them, much earlier, had been Bram Fischer. For him, there was no immediate conversion. He didn't become a communist in the Soviet Union or immediately when he returned to South Africa. But later, that great battle between socialism and fascism was what I think decided him. I do need to mention in this a very important figure, and that is his wife, Molly, who was born Susanna Johanna Kricher. They had a very long courtship from 1931 onwards, and thank goodness it was long, and thank goodness they were away from each other for very long periods of time, because otherwise they would not have written letters to one another. And because they wrote letters to one another, I was able to read them, feeling a bit, I have to say, like a voyeur reading them for the first time. Very complicated experience, reading people's private letters when you know they were not intended for you. So you try and deal with them as respectfully as possible. Well, Bram and Molly had a sort of up and down relationship. They were passionately in love. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But Molly was full of doubts. Bram, I think, had his own doubts. And because they were in different places, he was never really certain that he would end up marrying Molly. But there was something about Bram, and I think Molly too, was an abiding loyalty, an abiding fealty to people to whom he had committed himself. And you can see that in a very personal way in his relationship with Molly, and I think you can see it in his political affiliations as well. And when he returned to South Africa in the later 1930s, at first Bram Fischer was involved with liberal organizations, the Joint Councils. He was on the Alexandra Health Committee in Alexandra Township. But he gravitated towards the Communist Party and had joined probably by the early 1940s. There's some doubt as to when exactly he joined. It was a controversial decision that he took. I heard from Joel Mervis, the journalist, the South African journalist, of a dinner party in Johannesburg in the late 30s in which there was a stand-up argument between Bram Fischer and Malcolm Muggeridge. Malcolm Muggeridge, who'd written about forced collectivization and some of the some of the hardships that resulted from that. And he and Braun were in a stand-up argument. Bram's point was most likely that the Soviet Union was defenseless, that it was the West was trying to defeat it. Stalin had to do whatever he had to do to get by. And then with the invasion of the Soviet Union by the German forces, things sort of came into focus, and it was possible to be both a communist and to be part of this broad alliance. And I think that my way of understanding this is that in that moment, Bram and Molly were able to join up in many different senses. Obviously, joining the Communist Party was part of it, but I think it joined the different parts of their lives. The anti-imperialism, the anti-fascism, their commitment to a different South Africa, their commitment to a different kind of world. And they were able to exorcise the various contradictions or possible contradictions in their lives to live in a space of non-contradiction in which the local joined with the global. The war was a very exciting, involved, engaged time for all of them. So in the midst of this, I want to come back to this theme of identity because I think it was very important for Bram Fischer, and in fact one of his long-term legacies. He came to understand that to identify himself as a South African, he really had to transform his sense of himself. The word Africana, we sometimes forget, actually means African. That's what it means. And he understood that to identify himself as an Afrikaner, he had to identify himself with all of South Africa's people and make the word come into its full meaning. It never meant that he surrendered his identity as an Afrikaner. I think it was because he felt a particular responsibility as an Afrikaner that he joined the liberation movement. So for him, again, it was the only place of non-contradiction he could inhabit in his sense of self. And I think that was part of the legacy of 1994, the sense that South Africans of all descriptions had to find a way of thinking themselves as belonging to one country. For him, it was a very personal commitment, but it carried more than the usual kind of weight. When I interviewed Nelson Mandela, he pointed this out to me. He said, for me, life was difficult, but my choice was easy. I was fighting for my people. He said Bram Fischer had to fight against his people, right? And it's a more difficult thing to do. I think Bram Fischer never saw it as fighting against his people in that sense. He was fighting for his people to change their sense of who they were and who they could be. Because of the work that I do in other parts of my life, I belong to an English department, believe it or not. I think of this sometimes as a form of language. And it's not so much whether you speak Afrikaans or English. It goes much deeper than that. It has to do with the language underneath your language. What language are you speaking when you speak your language? Who are you speaking for? Who are you speaking to? And I think that group of people, Mandela and Fischer and many others who joined them in the 40s through the 50s, had to figure out what that language was. Mandela himself said to me that when he began, this is fairly well known, he was a convinced African nationalist. He really didn't want to have too much to do with white South Africans or Indians or people of mixed race. He said, though, which was when he saw that these people were prepared to take the same risks as he was, were prepared to put themselves on the line, that he began to trust them, they began to work together. And I think a lot of it has to do with trust. And I think that sense of trust was quite critical because I think of those people, Dennis will be able to correct me on this or improve on it in some way, but I think of those people as a nucleus who helped create this vision of a future South Africa. And their ties were very intimate ties. They were ties in which they belonged to one another almost as a family. And sometimes that became literal. There's a story, a very touching story, moving story, which I tell in the biography, Bram and Molly's son, Paul, their youngest child, had cystic fibrosis. And in those days, people with cystic fibrosis did not live very long. They were not expected to live very long, maybe to the age of 6 or 10. Bram and Molly never, I'm tempted to say mollycoddled, they never coddled Paul. They treated him, they allowed him to live his life. He lived eventually into his 20s. But he died while Bram Fischer was in prison. And Bryan was not allowed to go to his funeral. He heard the news on his own, was returned to his cell. When I spoke with Walter Sisulu, he said, when he heard that news, when they heard that Paul Fischer had died, he said it was devastating because he had stayed at the Fischer household many times. And he said he would hear Paul coughing in the night. It's very hard to breathe with cystic fibrosis. He heard Paul coughing in the night, and Bryan would go down to him. And he would hear the care and the love that Bryan had for Paul. And he said, when we heard the news that Paul had died, he said it was as if my own child had died. As if my own child had died. And it's that sense of family, of intimacy, of personal commitment, which I think was really crucial in forging a vision that came later, in which that family could be a much bigger South African family. So to me, this period of the 1940s, the 1950s, and indeed the 1960s was really critical in changing the shape of South Africa. The 60s were a much darker time, but those elements of what happened in 1994 were in place. So that when Nelson Mandela came out of prison, it wasn't as if he had to invent out of whole cloth his vision of the future. That vision had been established by many people working together. And look, he had many problems, and I'm not trying to suggest that everything was simple or easy. We all know that it really wasn't. But they had established this new kind of language, this new kind of syntax, this new form of people combining with one another to overcome apartheid. The transition in 1994 had to do with major and massive forces. There was the danger of complete war, of complete breakdown. I think the fact that that didn't happen, the fact that there was peaceful reconciliation, had a lot to do with this tradition, of which Bram Fischer was a very important part. Bram, of course, played his big role as a lawyer. He was involved in all the major political trials of the era. The treason trial from 1956 to 61, in which all 156 accused were acquitted. That trial, something I studied in detail. I must admit, I loved studying it. It's a vast trial. The records are absolutely vast, but it was worth every page, every minute of it, because you saw what a masterpiece it was of constructing a legal defense, of how that case was won at the beginning of the trial, not at the end. It was won when the defense made the prosecution shape an indictment they could not win. Okay, that's the way to do it. I'm not a legal expert, but in my view, if you want to win a case, that's a good way to do it. They did it, but by 1964, that had changed. The rules had changed. It had changed partly because the treason trial had ended in acquittals, and the state knew they couldn't have trials which worked according to the regular laws of evidence and logic. And so there was a new era of torture, of detention without trial. And by the time Mandela and the others, Dennis Goldberg as well, were put on trial in the Rivonia trial, you had to run a different kind of defense. It wasn't the kind of defense in which you would try and win the case on legal grounds. It was a political defense in which you would say what you stood for and why you stood for it. And that's what the accused did, very powerfully in that trial there. It was a different era for Bram and Molly, a different era which was much more cramped and much more confined. They were both banned, their movements were circumscribed. In the 1950s, despite everything, they'd still managed to travel. Bram went to Europe to various peace councils in the non-aligned movement. Molly Fischer had gone to China, of all things, and there she'd actually stood on a podium underneath Mao Zedong in 1954 for the 5th anniversary of the Chinese Revolution. But by the 60s, it was a completely different era. And so we get to that moment in the Rivonia trial, which ends in triumph, in life sentences. And then quickly turn to tragedy in the case of Bram Fischer. because the day afterwards, or 2 days afterwards, he and Molly and a third person were traveling down to Cape Town to see the accused on Robben Island. There was a freak accident, and the car went into a very deep pool of water, and Molly Fischer was drowned. And the accused in the trial have spoken about how when Bram got to Robben Island and they said to him, "Bram, how's Molly?" And he said, "No, all right, she's okay, Molly is all right." Because he did not want them to suffer any further distress. I mean, that was the kind of person that he was. But for him, it initiated a period of solitude, of exhaustion, of his own detention, and then release, and then his arrest. And then the story gets even more dramatic, because he was put on trial along with a number of other accused, charged with being members of the Communist Party. But Bram Fischer, remember, was a lawyer. He'd been involved in a case that originated in southern Rhodesia. It was about Bayer, as in Bayer aspirin. It was a patent case, and it had gone on appeal to the highest court. It so happened in those days, the highest court of appeal for Rhodesia was in London, the Privy Council. And Bram Fischer applied for bail from his own trial to argue the case in London, giving his word as an Afrikaner that he would return. He came to London, and his comrades here, according to what I've heard, tried to make him stay. They said, "Why go back? You can do much more outside of the country." And his decision was that he would go back. He'd given his word. He went back and stood trial again, and then on one day, 1965, instead of appearing in court, a letter was handed in which he said to the effect that I can no longer serve the interests of justice in the way in which I've tried to do so all these many years. I'm going underground to express my solidarity with others who have suffered in this country, with all of South Africa's people. And he said that going underground for him was nothing less than a duty, as he put it, a supreme duty, particularly for an Afrikaner. The Afrikaners had instituted apartheid, although segregation had existed for centuries, but he saw it as a particular duty in his own case. And I think there, that's where you can see Bram Fischer, the man, his sense of loyalty, his courage, his honor, and his daring, because he went underground. He was a distinguished lawyer. He was 57 years old, thereabouts, and he went into disguise. There were stories about how perhaps he had surgery. He didn't. He got some theater directors who helped him. First he went and he lost weight so that he would look different, and he had high blood pressure, so low weight meant that he didn't look so red in the face. He shaved his hair back, he grew a little beard, he changed his hair color, he put on some glasses. When he first came to Oxford, he had a rugby injury, and it had surgery on his knee, and he'd walked with a limp ever since then, with a slight gait. He changed that walk. He had a stick. He looked a bit like Professor Calculus, from the Tintin books, someone you wouldn't suspect of anything whatsoever. He walked the streets of Johannesburg. He saw people that he knew. He saw policemen who knew him. He went into chambers and saw his colleagues, and they didn't recognize him. His daughter Ilse said when she was told to go to a certain warehouse, she didn't know what was going to happen, and when this strange little figure walked in, she thought, it's done, we've been busted, they've come to arrest me. And then this figure looked at her and she said she saw in his eyes, a particular glint in his eyes, that it was her father. So, very dramatic, romantic in some sense, but not in others, because Braun was working with a very small group, and it was a group that was fighting against pretty overwhelming odds. People were being arrested, people were being tortured, and eventually Bram himself was rearrested after close to 10 months underground. Quite an amazing success in that way. He was arrested on the day after that Rhodesia declared UDI under Ian Smith, so the Rhodesian connection remained there. And this time he was put on trial. The stakes were much higher, and no longer just the threat of a 5-year sentence, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. And he made a a really sort of grand speech from the doc. And I think there were three major themes that run through it. One is his dedication to communism, to the insights to Marxism, to an economic theory of history and its future. The other theme was his duty as an Africana, as an individual. And the third, I think equally important, was a commitment to peace and reconciliation. What he said at the end of that long speech from the doc was this. He said, "All the conduct, my lord, with which I've been charged has been directed towards maintaining contact and understanding between the races of this country. If one day it may help to establish a bridge across which white leaders and the real leaders of the non-whites can meet to settle the destinies of all of us by negotiation and not by force of arms, I shall be able to bear with fortitude any sentence which this court may impose on me." The sentence was life imprisonment. But it's that focus on peace, on a reconciliation without a war, which I think was so very important to Bram Fischer. In prison, as Dennis knows better than anybody else, and Dennis, I'm sure, will fill us in on those stories a little later. To begin with, Braun was victimized because he had been an Afrikaner Volksverräter, a traitor. And yet he helped others. Warders came to him for help with their legal problems. And again, as Dennis and the other prisoners showed, prison was not the end of the struggle. It wasn't the end of your life. That struggle continued in there. People did everything they could to get news, to organize. They studied. Braun worked in the garden. They took exams. Braun was very old by the time he took exams inside prison. And the story which Hugh Lewin tells is that with one of the exams, this was through the University of South Africa, he needed some extra time. He just hadn't quite finished. And the prison guard said to him, "Ach maar Bram, vat so te sê 'n paar minute beseringstyd." And for those of you who need the translation, don't worry, Braun, just take a few minutes, so to speak, of injury time. And then came the story, and again, this I really should leave to Dennis Goldberg, that Braun was ill. And he wasn't quite sure of where he was. He fell in the shower, and it turned out that he had cancer, though it took some time to establish that. And all of this was written up. Dennis Goldberg may be too modest to talk about this, but Dennis Goldberg took extraordinary care of Bram Fischer in those days. He carried him, took care of him, and eventually wrote up the story in minute handwriting on tissue paper, small margins, small columns. And I had the privilege of reading those in London, I think at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, in the library there. And amazing to see the dedication and the devotion of the prisoners to one another. And again, the personal ties, so very, very important. So Braun was released a month or so before he died to the care of his brother in Bloemfontein, and indeed that's where he died in 1975. And when he was cremated, and messages were sent from all over the world, his family were not allowed to have his ashes, as these were regarded as still, quote-unquote, property of the prisons department. So that victimization carried on after his death. So how do we see Bram Fischer's legacy and the transition he helped bring about? When he died in 1975, it was a bad time. It was just before the Soweto uprising. The South African state was pretty much in control of things. Yet there were glimmerings, changes in Mozambique and Angola and elsewhere. What Braun would not have foreseen at that point, as nobody did, was how the end came in 1989. And there what happened was a twin set of changes. One was the end of apartheid, and the other was the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of communism. And for Braun, I can only imagine that it would have been a very strange moment. The local and the global, which had been joined for so long, had come apart to some extent. They were connected. I think the end of the Cold War had a fair bit to do with the transition in South Africa. And yet there was triumph on the local, failure on the global. It would have been a complicated moment for him. And from that perspective, if Braun were alive today, What would he say? One can only speculate. I felt in writing the book that, again, it would be a claim involving a certain degree of hubris, I think, to say that you know the man, that you know someone inside out. I don't think I would make that claim, but I did feel by the time I came to the end of the book that I knew how Braun would behave, what he would do under certain circumstances, what his commitments would be. So let me speculate by way of conclusion here on a few things. For one thing, I think Braun would have been tremendously proud of the peaceful transition in South Africa, especially since in the early 90s, that was not a given. It really was not a given. South Africa was on the edge of complete chaos. It came to pass through the work of many, and not just Bram Fischer, and not just Nelson Mandela, and not just the names we know, many whose names we really don't know at all. What Nelson Mandela said to me about Bram Fischer was that he was at peace with himself and therefore at peace with the world. I think when people say that kind of thing, they're also referring to themselves, because if you think of Mandela, he really was at peace with himself and at peace with the world. But that idea of being at peace with oneself, the idea of a South Africa at peace with itself is embedded there somewhere. And I think that's a very important legacy. I think he would have been proud of the idea of reconciliation, which as an Afrikaner he wanted more than else. I think Bram Fischer as a lawyer would have been extremely interested in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think parts of it would have irritated him because he had no patience for the perpetrators of atrocities, apartheid atrocities, and some of them really did get off pretty lightly in the TRC. But on another level, the idea of a peaceful reconciliation would have been appealing to him, and I think he would have had some interesting thoughts about that. I think he would have had some disappointments. He was quite traditional, quite conservative in his ways, but the lack of AIDS treatment would have shocked him. The degree of sexual violence in South Africa would have outraged him. I think corruption would have bothered and displeased him and depressed him more than anything else. He might wanted to have joined another movement. But I think, and here I'm just speaking quite personally, I think if I think of Bram Fischer's legacy and divide it into two categories, I think one can say this, that the social and economic components of his vision haven't really come to pass in the way that he might have hoped. There's still vast levels of unemployment, of economic disparity, and events such as the Marikana massacre would certainly have been almost unintelligible to Braun in a post-apartheid era, and I think he would have seen these as failures, if not betrayals. But what he would have been proud of, and what I think is worth reclaiming, is that notion of peace and reconciliation, the vision of a unified country under majority democratic rule. And I think that is very much Bram Fischer's legacy, a legacy of reconciliation between black and white, between Afrikaners and Africans and South Africans of all races, so that the word Africana could come into its full meaning. So there's a long way to go. One never reaches that horizon. Maybe one never reaches that promised land. But in the wayward workings of history, that reconciliation is something Bram Fischer helped to establish, a peaceful South Africa more than 20 years into its democratic history, with another April, another election on the near horizon. Bram Fischer has had an interesting afterlife. There are roads named after him, settlements, airports, memorials, lectures. There's the Bram Fischer Memorial Lecture at Oxford University. Through the work of Yvonne Milan and others she inspired, Braun was granted a posthumous honorary doctorate at the University of Stellenbosch. Talk about unthinkable things. It actually happened. And he's become ingrained in the fabric of South Africa, part of its extraordinary history. And in that respect, to me, he's still an image, not only for the present, but for the future. In that sense, he feels to me still like a prototype, still moving out there, ahead of everybody else. As I put it in the book, he came out of Africana nationalism. He died belonging to the whole of South Africa. He never saw this as a betrayal of Africana identity, but rather as its fulfillment, its extension towards a true meaning of the name African. He was a white man able to undertake, in the course of his own life, the personal transformation that must accompany, if not herald, the political. And he took it on, a story of identity, its retention and extension, into the marrow of his own life. That, I think, is a story that has resonance for everyone. In that way, I think Bram Fischer is still a challenge to us all. Thank you very much.
Stephen, thank you for starting us off with such a high standard and for keeping perfectly to time. Two fantastic achievements in their own right.